I hauled the last of my supplies up the metal stairs, my breathing ragged from the climb. The fire lookout tower stood alone on its rocky perch, surrounded by nothing but trees as far as I could see. 6 months in this place. Just me, the radio, and miles of Alaskan wilderness. "This'll do," I muttered, setting down my backpack on the wooden floor. The tower's single room was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 15 feet square, with windows on all sides. A small bed occupied one corner, a desk with radio equipment along another wall, and a tiny kitchenette with a propane stove in the third. The center of the room held a circular map table with a compass rose and sighting equipment. Everything was neat, but had the abandoned feeling of a place left in a hurry. Coffee cups washed and stacked beside the small sink. Bed made with military precision. Equipment arranged carefully on shelves. Nothing personal remained of whoever had been here before me. I moved to the radio console and noticed a piece of paper taped beside it. The handwriting was tight and urgent, pressed hard into the page. Rules. 1. If you see a woman in the woods, go inside immediately. 2. Stay inside after sunset, no exceptions. 3. Ignore all knocking after dark. 4. If you hear voices you recognize, do not respond. 5. At 3:33 a.m., if the lights flicker, turn off all power immediately and stay away from windows until dawn. 6. Never invite anyone inside after dark, even if they sound like someone you know. I snorted and pulled the paper down. Some kind of joke from the previous guy, I guessed. Probably the same reason he'd left early. Boredom. It happened in these isolated posts. People got weird when left alone too long. My supervisor had been vague about why the position had opened suddenly, just said there had been a personal emergency. I tossed the note onto the desk. I wasn't here for games or ghost stories. I was here because I needed to be nowhere for a while. Nowhere findable, nowhere with memories, nowhere that asked questions about my mother or my last job or my failed relationship. Just me in the trees and the simple task of watching for fires. After unpacking my clothes and storing my food supplies, I familiarized myself with the equipment. The radio system was older but well maintained. There were binoculars, maps of the region, a weather station, a first aid kit, and an emergency supply box. The standard issue handbook outlined my duties: morning and evening radio check-ins, regular perimeter sweeps, smoke monitoring, weather logging. Basic, straightforward work. Perfect. I spent the next few hours exploring my new home. The tower itself stood about 60 feet off the ground, providing a commanding view of the surrounding forest. The single room at the top connected to the ground via a series of metal stairs and landings that zigzagged down the frame. At the base, a small shed held additional supplies, tools, and emergency equipment. A narrow path led from the tower, clearing into the dense spruce forest. Around 4 in the afternoon, I decided to do my first official perimeter check. I grabbed the binoculars and began a systematic scan, starting with the north quadrant and working my way clockwise. The forest spread out below, a dense carpet of green broken occasionally by rocky outcroppings and small streams. When I swung the binoculars to the southern perimeter, I froze. About 200 yards away, partially visible between the trees, stood a figure. A woman in what looked like an old-fashioned dress, faded to a grayish color that nearly blended with the tree trunks behind her. She was standing completely still, facing directly toward the tower. I lowered the binoculars and looked with my naked eye. She was just a small shape at that distance, but definitely there, a pale smudge against the dark forest. "Hey!" I called out, my voice echoing across the clearing. The woman didn't move. I raised the binoculars again for a better look. She was thin, with long dark hair hanging limply around her shoulders. Her dress seemed to belong to another era, high-necked and long-skirted. But what struck me most was her complete stillness. Not the stillness of someone pausing or waiting, but a stillness that seemed almost impossible, like a photograph. And she was staring directly at me. Even at this distance, I could feel it. While I watched, she suddenly moved. Not the startled movement of someone caught staring, but a deliberate step forward. Then another. She began walking toward the tower with slow, measured steps. Her movements were smooth, but somehow wrong. Too even, too purposeful. Rule 1 from the note flashed in my mind. If you see a woman in the woods, go inside immediately. This is crazy, I said to myself, but I couldn't stop watching her approach. Each step she took made my skin crawl a little more. There was something profoundly wrong about her movement, about the way she never took her eyes off the tower as she navigated through underbrush and over fallen logs without looking down. When she cleared the tree line and stepped into the open area around the tower base, I felt a jolt of fear run through me. With the binoculars, I could now see her face more clearly, yet somehow it remained indistinct, like a photograph slightly out of focus. Her eyes, though, her eyes I could feel looking right into mine. The note, the rules. Suddenly, they didn't seem like a joke anymore. I pulled back from the window and glanced around the room. The door was already locked. I checked it earlier. I moved to each window, making sure they were all securely latched. By the time I finished, my hands were trembling slightly. "Get a grip, Mitchell," I told myself. "It's just some local woman, maybe a hiker who got turned around." But deep down, I knew better. No hiker moves like that. I returned to the window and watched her continue her approach. She had reached the bottom of the tower stairs now, but she didn't climb them. Instead, she began a slow circuit around the base, never taking her eyes off the windows above. For over an hour, I watched her circle the tower. The sun began to sink behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the clearing. As the light faded, she stopped directly below my window and looked up. I backed away, heart pounding. For several minutes, I stood in the middle of the room, afraid to look out again. When I finally gathered my courage and peered through the glass, the clearing below was empty. She was gone. I checked all four sides of the tower through the windows. Nothing. The forest had grown dark, with only the faint glow of twilight remaining in the western sky. Rule 2: stay inside after sunset. No exceptions. That one seemed easy enough to follow now. I turned on the lights in the tower and tried to distract myself by organizing my supplies and reviewing the duty roster for the coming week. But I couldn't shake the image of that woman from my mind, her unnatural stillness, those eyes. An hour after sunset, the first knock came. 3 soft taps on the door at the base of the tower. Distinct, deliberate, unmistakable. I went rigid, my back pressed against the door as if she might somehow push through multiple locks and 60 feet of vertical stairway. 3 more knocks, louder this time. Rule 3: ignore all knocking after dark. I pressed my hands over my ears and slid down to sit on the floor, my back still against the door, waiting for morning to come. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The knocking continued, sometimes fading to gentle taps that I strained to hear, then suddenly escalating to violent pounding that shook the entire tower. Each impact sent vibrations through the metal frame, up through the floor, and into my body. I pulled myself together enough to crawl to the small desk. Turning the radio on low, I found a station playing static-laced music, anything to drown out the sounds from below. The volume was just enough to blur the knocking without completely masking it. I needed to know if the sounds changed or stopped. For hours, I sat cross-legged in the center of the room, as far from the windows and door as possible. My watch showed that midnight was approaching. The knocking had settled into a rhythm now. 3 quick taps, pause, 3 quick taps, pause, almost like a code or a summons. When midnight struck, the knocking stopped abruptly. The sudden silence felt wrong, leaving only the low hum of the radio and my own breathing. I waited, listening intently. "Tommy? Tommy, are you up there?" My entire body went cold. That voice, I knew that voice better than my own. "Tommy, honey, please, I'm lost out here. It's so cold." My mother's voice, coming from somewhere beneath the tower, every inflection, every slight catch in her throat when she said my name. It was exactly her, but my mother had died 3 years ago in a hospital bed after months of fighting cancer that ate her from the inside out. I had held her hand when she took her last breath. "Tommy, please answer me. I need help." I bit down on my tongue, hard. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth, but the pain helped me focus. Rule 4: if you hear voices you recognize, do not respond. "I don't know where I am, Tommy. Everything looks different. Please come down. Please just let me in." Her voice broke on those last words, just like it used to when she was trying not to cry in front of me during her treatments. I pressed my fists against my eyes, feeling tears leak through my fingers. "It's not her," I whispered to myself. "It's not her." But it sounded so exactly like her that my body responded instinctively, wanting to go to her, help her, protect her. I had to physically wrap my arms around my knees to keep from moving toward the door. The pleading continued for what felt like hours. Her voice grew more desperate, more afraid. She described being cold, being hurt, being hunted by something in the woods. She begged me to save her, reminded me of times she'd cared for me when I was sick or scared. She recounted specific memories from my childhood that no stranger could possibly know. "Remember when you broke your arm falling from the treehouse and I sang to you all night in the emergency room? Tommy, please. I'm scared now. Please sing to me. Just let me know you're there." I rocked back and forth, humming tunelessly to myself to block out her voice. Not real, not real, not real. Whatever was out there wasn't my mother. The voice grew angry around 3 in the morning, becoming harsh and accusatory. "I gave everything for you. I suffered for you. And now you'll let me die out here? What kind of son are you?" That almost broke me. The words sliced through me like a knife, echoing my own thoughts during those final months of her illness when I had been too overwhelmed, too selfish to visit her every day. But I held on to the rules. I said nothing. I responded to nothing. As the first pale light of dawn crept across the eastern sky, the voice began to fade, growing distant and faint until it disappeared entirely. The forest outside returned to its normal sounds, birds awakening, wind rustling through the trees. I uncurled from my position on the floor, every muscle screaming in protest. I was drenched in sweat despite the cool night, and my tongue throbbed where I'd bitten it. Moving like an old man, I stood and approached the windows cautiously. The clearing below was empty. No woman in a faded dress, no mother calling for help. Just dew-covered grass and the dark line of trees beyond. I spent the next hour checking every window, scanning the forest edge with binoculars, looking for any sign of what had happened during the night. When I felt certain nothing was waiting outside, I unlocked the door and descended the metal stairs. Each step down made my stomach tighten, half expecting to find someone or something waiting below. The ground around the tower base was undisturbed. No footprints in the soft earth, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had stood below my window calling out with my dead mother's voice for hours. Circling the tower's perimeter, I examined every approach. Nothing. If someone had been here, they'd left no trace. Back inside, I made coffee with shaking hands and sat at the desk, trying to make sense of what had happened. The rules taped beside the radio now seemed less like a joke and more like a survival manual. They had known, whoever wrote them had known exactly what would happen. At 9, I called in my scheduled radio check. "Morning check-in from Lookout 7, I said when my supervisor answered. "Copy, Lookout 7. All good up there, Mitchell?" I hesitated, wondering how to explain what I'd experienced. Would they believe me, or would they think I was already cracking under the isolation? "All normal conditions," I replied. "No fires spotted. Weather clear." "Good to hear. Check in again at 1800 hours. Over." "Copy that. Over." I spent the rest of the morning in a fog, going through the motions of my duties while constantly glancing at the tree line. The woman hadn't reappeared, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. In the afternoon, I decided to properly organize the previous lookout's belongings. The tower was technically clean when I arrived, but there were still remnants of the former occupant. A few books on the shelf, a jacket hanging behind the door, cooking utensils that weren't standard issue. As I moved the small rug beside the bed, I noticed one of the floorboards wasn't properly aligned with the others. Curious, I knelt down and ran my fingers along the edge. The board shifted slightly. It wasn't nailed down. Prying it up revealed a narrow space beneath and tucked inside a metal box about the size of a large book. It was locked, but the key was taped to the bottom. My heart beat faster as I pulled it out and set it on the desk. Whatever was inside, someone had hidden it deliberately. I turned the key in the lock and the lid opened with a soft click. Inside were notebooks, 5 of them, all different sizes and styles. The oldest was a leather-bound journal with frayed edges. The newest, a standard spiral notebook with a Forest Service logo on the front. Nestled among them were loose papers, newspaper clippings, and what looked like old photographs. I picked up the newest notebook first and opened to the final entry. The handwriting was hurried, slanting across the page. May 12th. She's getting closer. I can't do this anymore. The date was just 2 weeks ago, right around when my supervisor said the previous lookout had left due to a personal emergency. I flipped back through the pages, reading entries at random. Each described encounters with the woman in the woods, knocking at night, voices that mimicked loved ones, increasing supernatural activity that followed a clear pattern. I set down the first journal and picked up another, this one dating back 5 years. Different handwriting, but similar experiences. Then another from 8 years ago, and another from 12 years back. With growing unease, I realized I was holding a record of horror spanning 15 years. Multiple lookouts had experienced exactly what I had just gone through. Some had fled after a few nights. Others had lasted weeks or months before breaking. The common thread through all the journals was the woman, always described the same way, always following the same patterns, always testing boundaries, looking for ways in. As I read more entries, I discovered that each lookout had added to the rules, refining them based on their experiences. The rule about 3:33 a.m. had been added by someone 7 years ago who claimed breaking it meant letting her inside permanently. The oldest journal contained theories about who or what she was. The writer believed she was tied to the land somehow, a guardian or spirit that had been disturbed when the Forest Service built the lookout tower. At the bottom of the box, beneath all the journals, I found a Polaroid photograph. It showed an abandoned cabin deep in the woods, its roof partially collapsed, windows dark and empty. Standing in the doorway was the woman in the faded dress, her features blurred despite the photo being in focus. The date stamp in the corner read 5 years earlier, and someone had written on the back, "Her home before the tower." I stared at the photo, a chill running through me despite the afternoon heat. She had been driven from her home when they built this tower. Now she wanted it back. The sun was beginning to sink toward the mountains. I carefully returned the journals to the box but kept out the most recent one. I needed to learn everything I could about what I was facing. Moving methodically around the tower, I prepared for another night. I pushed the bed and desk away from the windows. I checked the door locks repeatedly, noticing for the first time deep scratch marks around the frame that hadn't been there yesterday. By the time darkness fell, I had memorized every rule and added my own notes. I'd pushed furniture against the door. I'd hung blankets over the windows. I'd prepared myself mentally for whatever might come. As 9 o'clock approached, I peered through a small gap in the curtains at the clearing below. Right on schedule, she appeared. The woman in the faded dress, standing at the edge of the woods. This time she was closer, only about 50 yards from the tower base. She stood perfectly still, staring up at my window as if she knew exactly where I was looking from. I watched her through the gap, noting how she cast no shadow despite the bright moonlight. The temperature outside had dropped below freezing according to my thermometer, but she showed no reaction to the cold. For 3 hours, she remained completely motionless. Then, as midnight struck, she began to move, circling the tower base with slow, deliberate steps, never taking her eyes off my windows. I settled in for a long night, the journal open beside me, waiting for her next move. Whatever came, I was determined to follow the rules. They had kept others alive before me. They would keep me alive too. Unless, like the last lookout, I reached the point where I couldn't do this anymore. I lost track of time as I paged through the journals, my eyes burning from reading in the dim light. Each notebook told the same story with different handwriting, different dates, but identical experiences. The woman would appear first, testing boundaries. Then came the voices, always of dead loved ones, never the living. And finally, escalating supernatural activity that either drove the lookout away or forced them to adapt. The woman in the faded dress had been haunting this tower for 15 years at least, according to the oldest journal. The writing was faded and the pages yellow with age, but the fear was fresh on every line. "She's testing me," one lookout had written 8 years ago, "looking for weaknesses, ways to get inside. I don't think she wants to harm me exactly. She wants the tower." This was her territory before we came. I flipped to another entry from a different journal. Night 12. She used my brother's voice again. Said things only he would know. I almost opened the door. God help me, I almost did. The third journal contained detailed observations on her patterns, with careful notes on timing. She always appears at the edge of the forest at 9 p.m. exactly, no matter the weather, no matter if I'm watching or not. I traced my finger along a crude map someone had drawn, showing where the woman would stand on different nights. It matched exactly what I'd seen. She was following a precise routine that had remained unchanged for years. The fourth journal was from a lookout who'd lasted nearly a full season. I've started to think of her as my roommate. The entry read, A very strange roommate who lives outside and tries to trick me into letting her in every night. But as long as I follow the rules, we've reached a kind of understanding. But it was the newest journal that chilled me the most, the one from just 2 weeks ago. The writing grew increasingly erratic as the entries progressed. Night 47. She's changing her patterns, getting closer each night, learning. The knocking is different now, more insistent. She found my brother's voice last night. How does she know these things? How does she get in our heads? I read the final entry again. May 12th. She's getting closer. I can't do this anymore. What had happened on that night? What had driven the previous lookout to abandon his post after holding out for so long? Several entries across the journals mentioned the 3:33 a.m. rule as the most critical. One lookout had written in blocky capitals, 3:33 a.m. is the thin point. Do not break this rule. She can come in if you do. Another had added, breaking the 3:33 rule means letting her inside permanently. Turn off all power when the lights flicker. Stay away from all windows. Do not look outside no matter what you hear. I checked my watch. It was only 4 p.m. Hours until darkness. I had time to prepare. Everything clicked into place. The fire service had expanded its operations in this region about 15 years ago, right when the first journal entries began. They had built this tower on land that had belonged to someone else first. The woman hadn't come to haunt the lookouts. We had invaded her territory. She wasn't some random ghost or monster. She was protecting what she considered hers. I spent the next few hours preparing for nightfall. I moved the bed and desk away from all windows and into the center of the room. I hung the blankets over the glass again, leaving just a small gap that I could peer through. I filled all my water containers and laid out food that wouldn't need cooking in case I had to turn off the power. As I checked the door locks for the third time, my fingers brushed against something I hadn't noticed before. Deep scratch marks surrounded the door frame, gouging into the wood. They weren't random. They formed a pattern. 3 parallel lines repeated around the entire frame, almost like a warning or a message. These hadn't been here yesterday. I was sure of it. I would have noticed such obvious damage. She was getting bolder, testing the boundaries, looking for ways in. I took stock of my supplies. The Forest Service handbook recommended having 2 weeks of emergency rations, a first aid kit, emergency flares, and a backup radio. I had all of these, plus my own additions. A heavy flashlight that could double as a weapon, a hunting knife, and extra batteries for everything. Would any of it matter against her? The journals suggested physical barriers meant little to her. She could mimic voices, appear and disappear at will, and had strength enough to leave claw marks in solid wood. My only real protection was following the rules. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the forest, I settled into my chair in the center of the room. 9 o'clock was approaching. I kept my eyes on my watch, counting down the minutes. At exactly 9 p.m., I moved to the window and peered through the small gap in the curtains. She was there, just as the journals predicted. But she was closer now, only about 50 yards from the base of the tower, standing at the edge of the cleared area. Last night, she had kept to the tree line, 200 yards away. She was advancing, just as the most recent journal had warned. She stood perfectly still, her pale dress visible even in the growing darkness. The moon rose behind her, nearly full and casting enough light to see by. I noticed something the journals had mentioned. She cast no shadow despite the bright moonlight washing over the clearing. The temperature reading on my outdoor thermometer showed 28 degrees, well below freezing, but she showed no reaction to the cold. No shivering, no breath clouds, nothing to suggest she felt anything at all. For 3 hours, she remained in exactly the same position. Not a single movement, not a twitch or a shift of weight like a normal person would make. Just absolute stillness, her gaze fixed on my window as if she could see through the curtains to where I watched. I tried to make out her features, but even with the binoculars, her face seemed to blur and shift whenever I looked directly at it. The only constant was her eyes, dark pools that never blinked, never moved, just stared. When midnight struck, she finally moved. With the same deliberate steps I'd seen before, she began to circle the base of the tower. Slowly, methodically, each footstep placed with purpose. And all the while, her head remained tilted upward, eyes locked on the windows above. Unlike a normal person walking in a circle, who would need to turn their head to maintain focus on a fixed point, she kept her face turned toward me as she moved. Her body turned, but her head remained unnaturally fixed on the tower, as if her neck could rotate beyond human limits. I settled back in my chair, keeping an eye on the time. According to the journals, she would circle until around 3 a.m. Then came the real test. 3:33 a.m., when the lights would flicker and the true danger began. Several lookouts had noted that the scratching and knocking became more insistent at that hour, as if some barrier between worlds grew thin. I had hours to go before that moment, but I was as ready as I could be. I had memorized every rule. I knew what to expect. I wouldn't make the mistakes others had made. She continued her slow circuit of the tower, pausing occasionally to reach up and touch the metal supports with long, pale fingers. Each time she did, I heard a faint scraping sound, like nails on steel, that traveled up through the structure to where I sat. It was going to be another long night. The woman continued her slow circuit of the tower. Each time she completed a rotation, the metal structure would vibrate ever so slightly as she dragged her fingernails across the support beams. The sound traveled up through the frame and into my bones. I sat in the middle of the room, far from any window, tracking her movements by those faint metallic scrapes. According to my watch, she had been circling for nearly 3 hours now. The journals had prepared me for this. Her methodical testing of the boundaries, the patient exploration of my fortress. The old logbooks scattered around me had been both a blessing and a curse. They gave me the knowledge to survive, but also the terrifying awareness of what I was facing. I couldn't unsee the photographs, couldn't unread the desperate final entries of the lookout who had fled just 2 weeks ago. At exactly 3 in the morning, the scraping stopped. The sudden silence was more unsettling than the noise had been. I held my breath, listening for any sound. Nothing. Something pulled at me, an inexplicable urge to look outside. I fought it, remembering the warnings from the journals, but my body seemed to move of its own accord. I found myself at the gap in the curtains before I could stop. She stood directly below my window, her head tilted up at an impossible angle. Though the curtains were drawn tight except for my small peephole, her eyes locked onto mine immediately, as if the fabric wasn't even there. Her face remained frustratingly indistinct, like trying to focus on something underwater, but her eyes were clear, dark pools that reflected no light. I stumbled back from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. How had she known exactly where I was looking from? The tower had windows on all sides, and the curtains blocked any view of my position. My watch read 3:30 a.m., 3 minutes until the critical moment the journals had warned about. I quickly checked all the lights, the desk lamp, the ceiling fixture, the small reading light by the bed, all working normally. I positioned myself in the center of the room, as far from all windows as possible, and waited. The next 3 minutes stretched into an eternity. At 3:32, I placed my finger on the main power switch, ready to plunge the tower into darkness at the first sign of flickering. At exactly 3:33 a.m., every bulb in the tower began to pulse. The lights brightened to an almost painful intensity, then dimmed to nearly nothing, then flared again. The pattern was too regular, too deliberate to be a power surge. It was like the electricity itself was breathing. I slammed the main power switch down, plunging the tower into complete darkness. The sudden absence of light made the night seem solid, a physical presence pressing against my skin. My eyes strained to adjust, but there was no ambient light to help them. Even the moon seemed to have gone into hiding. That's when I heard it. The first footstep on the metal stairs outside. The sound was unmistakable, the hollow clang of weight on the steel treads. But it wasn't the light step of a woman. It was heavy, deliberate, making the entire tower frame shudder slightly. Another step followed, then another. Whatever was climbing the stairs weighed far more than any human should. Each footfall sent vibrations through the structure that I could feel through the soles of my feet. I pressed my back against the wall farthest from the door, counting the steps. 15, 20, 30. The tower stood 60 feet tall with approximately 45 steps to reach my door. The footsteps were unhurried, taking the stairs one at a time with terrible patience. At the 40th step, I held my breath. The final footsteps landed on the platform outside my door. The metal landing creaked under the weight, a low, stressed sound I'd never heard it make when I used the stairs. Then silence. Complete and absolute stillness that seemed to stretch the darkness even thinner. The doorknob turned slowly to the right. I watched its silhouette against the slightly less dark rectangle of the door. It rotated to its limit, held for several seconds, then reversed direction, turning back until it could go no further left. Testing the lock, finding it secure. After the handle stopped moving, a new sound began, soft scratching against the wooden doorframe. It wasn't frantic or violent, but methodical, almost curious, like fingers exploring the texture and strength of the wood, searching for weaknesses. I remained frozen against the wall, not daring to move or make a sound. The scratching continued for what seemed like hours but might have been minutes. My sense of time had completely distorted in the absolute darkness. Through the walls I heard something else, breathing, but not the quick, nervous breaths of a person. This was deep, rhythmic, and unnaturally slow. Each inhale lasted several seconds, followed by an equally long exhale. It reminded me of wind moving through a deep cavern, powerful, ancient, and utterly inhuman. The breathing and the scratching continued together, creating a terrible harmony that made my skin crawl. I wanted to cover my ears, to block out the sounds, but I was too afraid to move. If I made the slightest noise, would it, know exactly where I was standing? I glanced at my watch. The luminous dial read 3:34 a.m. As if a switch had been flipped, everything stopped. The scratching, the breathing, all ceased in the same instant. The sudden silence was almost as shocking as the noises had been. The footsteps began again, moving away from the door. Down one step, then another. The same heavy, deliberate pace, but retreating now. I counted again, backward this time as the steps descended the staircase. When the last footfall faded, normal forest sounds gradually returned. The rustle of wind through trees, the occasional call of a night bird, the world resetting itself to ordinary reality. I remained against the wall until my legs cramped and my back ached, afraid that any movement might bring her back. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear. I slid down to sit on the floor, still keeping away from all windows as the journals had instructed. I must have fallen asleep there, because the next thing I knew, gray light was filtering through the edges of the curtains. Dawn had come. Even in the safety of daylight, I hesitated before turning the power back on. When I finally flipped the switch, the lights came on normally, as if nothing unusual had happened during the night. My muscles protested as I stood and stretched. Every part of me ached from the hours spent rigid with fear. I approached the door cautiously and pressed my ear against it, listening for any sound from outside. Nothing. I unlocked the door and eased it open, prepared to slam it shut at the first sign of danger. The platform was empty. The metal stairs stretched down to the ground, looking exactly as they always had. No sign of damage, no evidence that anything unusual had climbed them during the night. The morning air was crisp and clean. Birds flew between trees at the edge of the clearing. Everything looked painfully normal, making me question if I'd imagined the entire night. Then I saw the door frame. Deep gouges surrounded the lock, cutting into the solid wood. These weren't the random scratches of an animal. They formed distinct patterns, 3 parallel lines repeated around the entire frame. Some were shallow, mere surface marks. Others went completely through the wood, penetrating to the other side. I ran my fingers along the gouges, feeling the rough, splintered edges. They were fresh, and they were deliberate. Not the result of random clawing, but precise, controlled cuts into the wood. Whatever had made them had incredible strength and fine motor control. 3 of the gouges went completely through the 2-inch thick frame. I put my eye to one of them and could see straight through to the outside. If she had wanted to break the door down, she could have, but that wasn't her purpose. She was sending a message, marking her territory. At 9 o'clock, I made my scheduled radio check-in. "Morning check-in from Lookout 7, I said when my supervisor answered. "Copy, Lookout 7, all quiet up there?" "Normal conditions," I lied. "No fires spotted, weather clear." I hesitated, then added, "The door frame has some damage. Looks like an animal might have tried to get in." There was a pause on the other end, longer than usual. "What night are you on now, Mitchell?" my supervisor asked, their voice suddenly tense. "3rd night, 4th coming up tonight." Another pause. "Keep an eye on that door. Make sure it's secure." Their voice had shifted, becoming careful, measured. "We've had some issues with the wildlife up there. Nothing serious." I thought about the journals hidden under the floorboard, about the deep gouges in the solid wood frame, about the inhuman breathing I'd heard through the walls. "Nothing serious," I repeated. "The area's pretty remote. Gets to people sometimes." They cleared their throat. Had a couple lookouts request emergency evacuations from that tower. Both on their 4th night, actually. My grip tightened on the radio. What happened to them? Personal issues. Couldn't handle the isolation. Their tone made it clear the conversation was over. Check in again at 1800 hours. Over. Copy that. Over. I put the radio down and looked at the doorframe again. 3 parallel lines, repeated over and over, like claw marks, or like counting. 1, 2, 3. 4th night coming up tonight. The claw marks were much worse in the daylight. I traced my fingers along the deep gouges in the wooden doorframe, feeling the splinters catch on my skin. The pattern was too deliberate to be random. 3 parallel lines repeated over and over. They reminded me of tally marks, like someone counting or keeping score. I walked the perimeter of the tower platform, examining it inch by inch. Now that I knew what to look for, I found evidence everywhere. Deep gouges in the wooden planks that made up the platform, metal railings that had been subtly bent as if by incredible force, and most disturbing, scratch patterns on several windows that mirrored those on the door frame. 3 parallel lines. Counting down. I took a deep breath and went back inside to grab my jacket and the tower key. If I was going to survive another night, I needed to take action. The metal stairs creaked under my weight as I descended to the ground level. Each step reminded me of those heavy, deliberate footfalls from the night before. I kept glancing over my shoulder, though I knew logically that she only appeared after sunset. At the base of the tower sat a small shed that served as a storage unit for maintenance supplies. I'd barely given it a second glance when I first arrived, but now it represented my best hope for reinforcing my defenses. The door squeaked on rusty hinges as I pulled it open, revealing shelves stacked with tools, spare parts, and building materials. I found what I needed: several lengths of 2x4 lumber, a box of heavy screws, and a battery-powered drill that still had some life in it. I gathered everything I could carry and made my way back up the stairs, my arms burning from the weight by the time I reached the top. For the next few hours, I worked methodically, cutting the lumber to size and screwing it across the doorframe in an X pattern. I added similar reinforcements to the windows, leaving small gaps so I could still see out. The work was exhausting but gave me purpose. Each screw I drove into the wood felt like a small victory. When I finished, I stepped back to examine my handiwork. The tower looked like it was preparing for a hurricane, boards crisscrossing every potential entry point. It wouldn't stop her completely. The journals made it clear that physical barriers alone weren't enough, but it might slow her down. My stomach growled, reminding me that I hadn't eaten since the previous day. I heated a can of beans on the propane stove and sat at the desk to eat, spreading the journals out in front of me. Now that my immediate security concerns were addressed, I could focus on learning more. I picked up the journal that seemed most relevant, from a lookout who had survived an entire season in the tower. Their entries started much like mine, filled with fear and confusion, but gradually shifted to something closer to acceptance. Night 27, I read aloud, scooping beans into my mouth. She's becoming predictable. Arrives at 9 p.m. Circles until midnight. Knocking starts at 12:30. Voice mimicry at 1 a.m. The 3:33 event is still the most dangerous, but as long as I follow the rules exactly, she can't get in. It's almost becoming routine. I flipped forward several pages. Night 59. I've noticed she becomes more aggressive after I break even the smallest rule. Last night, I accidentally looked out the window at 3:35 a.m., just 2 minutes after the critical time. The scratching was so violent I thought she'd tear the entire door off. Lesson learned: follow all rules exactly. The final entry from this lookout was dated at the end of their season. Night 184, last night in the tower. She was there as always, but it felt almost like saying goodbye to a strange roommate. I've learned her patterns, respected her boundaries, and she's respected mine. I wonder if the next lookout will figure it out or if they'll run like so many others. I set that journal aside and picked up another. This one contained more theories about the woman's origins. The Forest Service expanded into this region 15 years ago, the entry read. They built this tower on what was once private property, a homestead that had been abandoned for decades. I hiked out about 10 miles east yesterday and found the remains of a cabin. Even from a distance, I felt watched. I took one photo and left immediately. I won't go back there. That's her place, not mine. I pulled out the Polaroid I'd found and studied it again. The cabin looked ancient, its roof partially collapsed. But the woman in the doorway stood straight and still, guarding what remained of her home. She wasn't a random ghost or monster. She was protecting her territory that I was now occupying. I spent the next few hours reading every journal entry I could find, looking for patterns and clues. Some lookouts had lasted only days before requesting emergency evacuation. Others had endured for weeks or months. The difference seemed to be whether they treated the woman as an enemy to be defeated or as a territorial entity to be respected. Those who tried to fight back, setting traps, attempting to communicate, or breaking the rules to test boundaries, didn't last long. Those who simply followed the rules and accepted her presence survived. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself thinking about why I'd taken this job in the first place. After my mom died from cancer, I'd felt unmoored, drifting from one temporary job to another, unable to maintain relationships or put down roots anywhere. When my girlfriend of 2 years told me she couldn't handle my emotional distance anymore, I hadn't even argued. I'd simply packed my things and left. Taking this fire lookout position had been just another way of running. 6 months of isolation where no one could reach me, where I wouldn't have to deal with grief or connection or any human complications. But I couldn't run from this. Whatever the woman in the woods was, she wasn't something I could escape by packing up and leaving. She'd still be here, waiting for the next lookout, continuing her endless vigil, and I'd just be doing what I always did, fleeing from difficulty rather than facing it. I looked at my watch. The sun would set in about an hour. My 4th night was approaching, the night when the previous lookout had broken. I took a deep breath and made a decision. I wasn't going to run this time. I would stay, follow the rules perfectly, and find a way to coexist with whatever haunted this tower. I spent the remaining daylight preparing. I filled all water containers, laid out food that wouldn't need cooking, double-checked my reinforcements, and reviewed all 6 rules until I could recite them from memory. I moved my chair to the center of the room, positioning myself equally distant from all windows and doors. As the sun dipped below the mountains and darkness crept across the forest, I felt strangely calm. Not the false bravado of someone denying danger, but the genuine acceptance of someone who understands the rules of engagement. At exactly 9 o'clock, I allowed myself one quick glance through a gap in the window boards. She was there, standing at the edge of the clearing, exactly where I expected her to be. But tonight, instead of 50 yards away, she stood barely 30 yards from the base of the tower. She was getting closer, just as the journals had warned. I pulled back from the window and settled into my chair. For the first time since I'd seen her, I didn't feel overwhelming terror. She wasn't evil, not in any human sense. She was simply territorial, protecting something in these woods that humans had disrupted when they built this tower. The night proceeded as expected. At midnight, I heard her begin her slow circuit of the tower base. The metal frame vibrated faintly with each brush of her fingers against the support beams. At 12:30, the knocking started. 3 soft taps on the door downstairs, repeated at irregular intervals. I ignored it completely. At 1 a.m., my mother's voice called up from below. "Tommy, please help me, it's so cold out here." Her voice was perfect. Every inflection, every subtle crack when she said my name. But I no longer felt the gut-wrenching pain of the previous night. I recognized it for what it was, a tool the woman used, not out of cruelty, but because it had worked on others, a key that had unlocked doors before. "I know you can hear me, Tommy," my mother's voice continued. "Why won't you help me, after everything I did for you?" I remained seated, breathing slowly and evenly. I didn't press my hands over my ears this time. I simply let the voice wash over me without response. As 3:33 a.m. approached, I moved to the power switch and placed my finger on it, ready. At exactly 3:32, I turned off all electricity in the tower, plunging the room into darkness. I didn't wait for the lights to flicker this time. I was taking no chances. The darkness was absolute. I moved carefully back to my chair in the center of the room, using my memory of the layout to avoid bumping into anything. I sat down and waited. Right on schedule, I heard the first heavy footstep on the metal stairs. The sound was different tonight, even weightier, making the entire tower shudder slightly with each step. Whatever was climbing those stairs seemed larger, more substantial than before. I counted silently. 15 steps, 20, 30, 40. Then the final few steps onto the platform outside my door. The reinforcements I'd installed creaked as something pressed against them. I heard wood groan under pressure but hold firm. Then came a new sound, scratching not just at the door but at multiple windows simultaneously, as if she had somehow multiplied or extended herself to test every potential entry point at once. I remained perfectly still, focusing on my breathing, reminding myself of what I'd learned. She couldn't enter unless invited. She was bound by rules just as I was. This wasn't a siege but a test, a nightly ritual that had been playing out for 15 years. The scratching continued for nearly half an hour, occasionally punctuated by my mother's voice calling out from multiple directions at once. Sometimes the voice came from the door, sometimes from the windows, sometimes from directly above me as if she were on the roof. Through it all, I remained seated in the darkness, neither responding nor hiding, simply waiting. At exactly 4 a.m., everything stopped. The scratching ceased. The voices fell silent. The heavy presence outside seemed to retreat, footsteps descending the stairs one by one until they faded entirely. I stayed in position until dawn, not willing to risk moving too soon. As the first gray light filtered through the gaps in my window coverings, I slowly stood, my joints stiff from sitting motionless for hours. I turned the power back on and systematically checked each window and the door. My reinforcements had held, though several boards showed fresh scratches, deep gouges in the wood that matched those on the doorframe. But something was different about these marks. They weren't just random claw marks. They formed distinct patterns. 3 lines, yes, but arranged in what almost looked like letters or symbols, a communication of sorts, or a warning. I went to the metal box under the floorboard and pulled out a blank notebook I'd found there yesterday. On the first page, I wrote the date and began to document everything that had happened during the night, adding my observations to the record left by previous lookouts. At the end of my entry, I added my own contribution to the rules. When she tests multiple entry points at once, remain perfectly still and centered in the room. Any movement toward a window or door during this time will be interpreted as invitation. I closed the notebook and returned it to the box, leaving it unlocked now. This was no longer a secret to be hidden but a manual to be maintained and passed on. I had accepted my role, not just as a fire lookout, but as guardian of both the forest and the knowledge of its supernatural inhabitant. As the morning sun rose fully over the trees, I made coffee and prepared for another day of vigilance. Tonight would be my 5th night. The journal suggested that if I could make it through 7 nights without breaking any rules, the woman would settle into a more predictable pattern. A strange coexistence would be established. I looked out at the forest stretching to the horizon, beautiful and mysterious in the morning light. This tower, this job had turned out to be nothing like what I had expected. But for the first time in years, I wasn't running from my problems. I was facing them head on, night after night, establishing boundaries and learning to live with both the darkness outside and the darkness within.